Rheinberg, British Zone of Occupation, Germany, May 17, 1945, 9:14 a.m. The truck lurched to a stop outside the medical tent, its canvas sides flapping in the spring wind that carried the smell of disinfectant and wet earth. From inside came the sound of boots hitting gravel, not marching, just shuffling, the exhausted stumble of men who had walked too far on too little. The guards didn't shout. They simply opened the gate and gestured, "This way, single file, no talking." One figure near the back of the line caught the eye of the British medical orderly standing at the tent entrance. Not because of his uniform, they all wore the same grey-green Wehrmacht remnants, torn and filthy, but because of his size. He was tiny. A child wearing a soldier's coat that hung past his knees, the sleeves rolled up 3 times and still covering his hands. His face was gaunt, the bones pressing against skin so thin it looked translucent in the morning light. His eyes were enormous, dark, and utterly empty. The orderly, a corporal named Davies who had processed thousands of prisoners in the past 2 weeks, felt something cold settle in his stomach. He stepped forward, blocking the boy's path. "How old are you?" Davies asked in German. The boy looked up. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "How old?" Davies repeated. 15, the boy whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Davies stared. Then he turned and called to the medical officer inside the tent. "Sir, you need to see this one." They expected soldiers, and what they found was a child who weighed less than a sack of grain. The boy's name, according to the papers he carried in a pocket sewn into the lining of his coat, was Klaus Mertens. The papers were Wehrmacht issue, stamped and signed, identifying him as a member of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, the last desperate conscription of boys and old men thrown into the collapsing front lines in the final months of the war. Born March 1930. Conscripted February 1945. Captured May 1945, near the ruins of a town whose name had been burned off the map. He had been a soldier for 3 months. He looked like he had been starving for 3 years. The medical officer who examined him was Captain Robert Hastings, Royal Army Medical Corps, a general practitioner from Kent who had spent the war in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine. He had seen malnutrition before, POWs, concentration camp survivors, displaced civilians. But this was different. This was a child who should have been in school, playing football, stealing apples from orchards. Instead, he stood in a drafty medical tent wearing a uniform 5 sizes too large, shivering despite the wool blanket someone had draped over his shoulders. Hastings gestured to the examination table. "Sit," he said in German. Klaus obeyed. His movements were slow, mechanical, as though every action required conscious thought. Hastings unwrapped the blanket and began his examination. He checked the boy's pulse, weak, irregular. His temperature, slightly elevated. His eyes, sunken, the sclera faintly yellow. His skin, dry, flaking, covered in sores that had scabbed over without proper healing. His teeth, loose in the gums, several missing. His hair, brittle, coming out in clumps when touched. Then Hastings lifted the boy's shirt. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The boy's ribs were visible, every one of them, pressing against skin that seemed stretched over bone with nothing in between. His stomach was distended, swollen with the fluid retention that comes from severe protein deficiency. His limbs were skeletal, arms no thicker than broom handles, legs that looked incapable of supporting weight. Hastings called to Davies. "Get the scale." They weighed him. 68 pounds. 31 kilograms. The average weight of a 7-year-old child. Hastings wrote the number on the chart, then set down his pen and looked at Klaus. The boy was staring at the floor, his face blank, as though he had left his body and gone somewhere else. "When did you last eat?" Hastings asked. Klaus blinked. "I don't remember." "Yesterday? The day before?" "I don't remember. We were given bread. Sometimes. There was no bread yesterday. Or the day before. I think." Hastings felt rage building in his chest, not at the boy, but at the system that had done this. The regime that had taken children and fed them into the machinery of war as though they were expendable. The commanders who had sent 15-year-olds into combat with weapons they could barely lift and rations that didn't exist. But rage was not useful. Rage would not heal this boy. So Hastings pushed it down, locked it away, and focused on what could be done. "You're going to be all right," he said quietly. "We're going to feed you. Slowly. Carefully. Your stomach can't handle much right now, but we'll build you back up. Do you understand?" Klaus looked at him. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not hope. Not relief. Just a faint, distant curiosity. Why? He asked. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Klaus Mertens had been conscripted on February 14, 1945, his 15th birthday. He had been at home in a village outside Dresden when the Volkssturm officers came to the house and told him to report to the local assembly point. His mother had wept. His father, too old for military service, working in a munitions factory, had said nothing, just handed Klaus his own coat because the boy didn't have one warm enough. The training had lasted 2 weeks. They learned to march, to salute, to recognize ranks. They were given rifles, old Czech models from the 1930s, most of them missing parts, and told to conserve ammunition because there was none to spare. They were told they would defend the fatherland. They were told they were soldiers now. Klaus had not felt like a soldier. He had felt cold, hungry, and terrified. By mid-March, his unit, 80 boys and men, the youngest 13, the oldest 6 to 7, were sent east to reinforce positions near the Oder River. They dug trenches in frozen ground, sheltered in barns and ruined houses, and waited for orders that never came. The front collapsed around them. The Soviets advanced. The unit fragmented. By April, Klaus was wandering westward with a handful of others, trying to reach the American or British lines because the rumors said surrender to the West meant survival. He didn't remember much of the journey. Just hunger, cold, the weight of the rifle he eventually discarded because he could no longer carry it. Just walking. Always walking. Sleeping in ditches. Drinking from puddles. Watching other boys drop and not get up. When the British found him on May 15th, he was alone, sitting beside a road, too weak to continue. A patrol had stopped, asked his name, given him water, and loaded him into a truck with other prisoners. He had expected to be shot. Instead, they brought him here. The camp at Reinberg was a temporary facility, one of dozens established across the British zone to process the flood of prisoners surrendering in the war's final weeks. It was not comfortable, rows of tents surrounded by wire fencing, latrines dug in trenches, food cooked in field kitchens, but it was organized. There were medical tents, registration stations, Red Cross personnel. The British had a system. And the system, however imperfect, operated on principles encoded in directives from London. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, and processed efficiently. Not charity. Policy. But policy, in this context, became a form of salvation. Klaus was assigned to a medical recovery section, a separate tent for prisoners requiring intensive care before they could be transferred to regular POW facilities. There were 30 others in the tent, all of them suffering from malnutrition, disease, or wounds that had gone untreated. Most were older than Klaus. A few were younger. He was given a cot with clean sheets, the first he'd seen in months. He was given a blanket, thick and scratchy and smelling faintly of mothballs. And he was given food. Not much. Not yet. Captain Hastings explained through an interpreter that refeeding had to be gradual. Too much food too quickly would kill him, refeeding syndrome, the body's inability to process nutrients after prolonged starvation. So Klaus received small portions every 3 hours, a cup of broth, a piece of dry toast, a spoonful of porridge. Each meal was measured, recorded, supervised. At first, Klaus couldn't keep it down. His stomach cramped. He vomited. He lay curled on his side, shaking, convinced he was dying. But the orderly stayed with him, brought clean water, wiped his face, told him it would pass. And slowly, painfully, it did. By the 3rd day, he could keep down the broth. By the 5th day, he could eat the toast. By the 7th day, he could sit up without assistance. And for the first time since February, Klaus allowed himself to believe he might survive. I did not understand why they were helping me. I had been taught that the British were cruel, that prisoners were worked to death or shot. But the doctor came every day. He checked my pulse, asked how I felt, adjusted my food. He never shouted. He never hit me. Once, when I vomited on his shoes, he just cleaned them and told me not to worry. I wanted to ask him why. But I was afraid to hear the answer. The philosophy governing Klaus's treatment was not unique to him. It was part of a broader policy established by the Allied forces in the aftermath of Germany's collapse. The scale of the humanitarian crisis was unprecedented. Millions of POWs, displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, all requiring immediate care. The temptation to prioritize Allied personnel and civilians was strong. But the decision was made, at the highest levels, that prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions regardless of what their own government had done. Security. Diplomacy. Morality. The reasons were multiple, overlapping, pragmatic. Humane treatment reduced resistance, ensured reciprocity for Allied POWs, upheld international law, and demonstrated, visibly, powerfully, the difference between democratic nations and the regime they had defeated. It was policy. But in that medical tent, with Captain Hastings monitoring Klaus's heart rate and adjusting his caloric intake and speaking to him in careful, accented German, policy became personal. It became the difference between death and life. By the end of the second week, Klaus had gained 4 pounds. He could walk to the latrine without assistance. He could sit up for an hour at a time. His skin began to lose its grayish pallor. The sores on his arms and legs started to heal. He was still desperately thin, still weak, but he was improving. The other patients in the recovery tent noticed. One of them, a man named Friedrich, perhaps 40, a soldier captured near Hamburg, had been watching Klaus from the adjacent cot. "You're the boy," Friedrich said one evening after the orderlies had distributed the evening meal. Klaus looked over. "What?" "The one who came in weighing nothing. We heard about you. The guards were talking. They said you were 15. They said you looked like a skeleton." Klaus didn't know how to respond. He looked down at his hands, still skeletal, the bones too prominent, but stronger than they had been. "I'm getting better," he said quietly. Friedrich nodded. "We all are. It's strange, isn't it? We were told the British would starve us. Make us work until we died. But here we are. Being fed. Being treated. Why do you think they do it?" Klaus asked. Friedrich was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because they can afford to. Because they won. And maybe because they want us to know the difference between them and us." Klaus thought about this. What difference? That they are civilized. And we weren't. The daily routine of the medical tent was monotonous but reassuring. Morning roll call at 7. First meal at 8. Medical rounds at 9. Second meal at 11. Rest period. Third meal at 2. Evening rounds at 4. Final meal at 6. Lights out at 9. Klaus found comfort in the structure. After months of chaos, the disintegration of his unit, the aimless wandering, the constant fear, routine felt like safety. He knew what would happen each day. He knew food would come. He knew the doctor would check on him. He also began to notice small kindnesses that went beyond protocol. The orderly who always made sure Klaus received an extra piece of bread if there were leftovers. The nurse who brought him a book in German, a collection of folk tales, worn and dog-eared, from her personal belongings. The guard who allowed the prisoners to sit outside the tent in the afternoon sun, not because regulations required it, but because he believed it would help them heal. These gestures were not dramatic. They were not life-saving. But they accumulated, layer by layer, building a foundation of trust that Klaus hadn't known he needed. One morning in early June, Captain Hastings arrived during rounds with a camera. He explained, through the interpreter, that he was documenting the recovery process for medical records and possibly for war crimes investigations. He wanted to photograph Klaus, to show the condition he'd arrived in versus his current state. Klaus agreed. He stood beside his cot while Hastings positioned the camera, adjusted the light, and took several photographs. Then Hastings showed him the first photo, taken on the day Klaus arrived, emaciated, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand. Klaus stared at the image. He didn't recognize himself. The boy in the photograph looked like something from a nightmare, a corpse that had somehow remained upright. He felt bile rise in his throat. "That's not me," he said. "It is," Hastings said gently. "That's what you looked like 3 weeks ago." Klaus couldn't look away. "I don't remember being that close to death." Hastings finished. "You were. Another week, maybe less, and we wouldn't have been able to save you." Klaus set the photograph down. His hands were shaking. "Why did you?" Hastings had been asked this question before, by other prisoners, by his own staff, by journalists who visited the camp. His answer was always the same. "Because you're a human being," he said. "And that's reason enough." By mid-June, Klaus had been transferred from the medical recovery tent to a regular POW section. He weighed 82 pounds, still far below healthy, but enough that he no longer required intensive medical supervision. He was assigned to a barracks with other young prisoners, given work duties, light tasks like sorting supplies, sweeping, assisting in the kitchens, and gradually integrated into the camp's daily life. The transition was difficult. After weeks of being cared for, of having his needs anticipated and met, he was now expected to fend for himself. The barracks were crowded, noisy, chaotic. The other prisoners were not hostile, but they were not gentle either. They had their own traumas, their own survival strategies, their own hierarchies. Klaus struggled to find his place. He was younger than most, weaker, quieter. He kept to himself, avoided confrontation, and tried to be invisible. But invisibility was hard when you were the boy who had arrived weighing 68 pounds. One evening, a group of older prisoners, men in their 20s, former soldiers who carried themselves with the residual confidence of those who had seen combat, approached him in the barracks. Their leader, a man named Otto, looked Klaus up and down. "You're the skeleton," he said. "The one the British nursed back to life." Klaus nodded, wary. "How old are you really?" 15. Otto shook his head. 15. Jesus. What were you? Volkssturm? Yes. Did you see combat? No. We walked. We tried to reach the lines. Most of my unit died on the way. Otto's expression softened, just slightly. You were lucky. I don't feel lucky. You're alive, Otto said. That's luck. Most of us shouldn't be. The fact that we are, that the British didn't just shoot us or leave us to starve, that's more luck than we deserve. Klaus looked at him. Do you believe that? That we don't deserve to live? Otto was silent for a moment. Then he said, I don't know what we deserve. I just know what we got. And it's more than we gave anyone else. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. The summer passed slowly. Klaus gained weight, 90 pounds by July, 98 by August. His hair grew back, thick and dark. The sores healed completely. He could work a full day without collapsing. He began, tentatively, to talk to the other prisoners, to share stories, to laugh occasionally at jokes that weren't particularly funny but felt good anyway. He also began to process what had happened to him. At night, lying in his bunk, he would replay memories, his mother's face when the Volkssturm officers came. The cold of the trenches. The sound of artillery in the distance. The boy who had been walking beside him who simply stopped, sat down, and never got up. The taste of broth in the medical tent. Captain Hastings's voice saying, You're going to be all right. He wrote letters home, though he had no idea if they would arrive. His family had been in Dresden. Dresden was gone. But he wrote anyway, describing where he was, what had happened, how he was recovering. The act of writing felt important, even if the letters went nowhere. In August, a Red Cross representative visited the camp and interviewed prisoners about their families, trying to establish contact with relatives or locate missing persons. Klaus gave them his parents' names, his address, any information he could remember. The representative wrote it all down and promised to do what she could. 3 weeks later, Klaus received a letter. It was from his mother. She was alive. She was in a displaced persons camp near Munich. His father was dead, killed in an air raid in April. His younger sister was with their mother. They were surviving. Klaus read the letter 5 times. Then he sat on his bunk and cried, not from grief, though there was grief, but from relief so profound it felt like drowning. In September, the camp organized a small ceremony to mark the end of the European War, a belated observance, given that the fighting had ended in May, but meaningful nonetheless. The prisoners were assembled in the central yard. A British chaplain spoke, first in English, then in German, about peace, about rebuilding, about the hope of reconciliation. Klaus listened, skeptical. Reconciliation seemed impossible. How could you reconcile what had been done? How could you forgive the unforgivable? But then the chaplain said something that stuck with him. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing not to let hatred define your future. Klaus turned the words over in his mind. He thought about Captain Hastings, who had every reason to hate German soldiers and had instead spent weeks keeping him alive. He thought about the orderlies, the nurses, the guards who had treated him with decency. He thought about Otto, who believed they didn't deserve to live but was grateful anyway. Maybe reconciliation wasn't about grand gestures. Maybe it was about small choices, repeated daily. About treating people as people, even when they were supposed to be enemies. One afternoon in October, Klaus was working in the camp kitchen when Captain Hastings appeared. Klaus hadn't seen him in months. Hastings had been reassigned to another facility, but he recognized him immediately. Klaus, Hastings said, smiling. I heard you were still here. How are you feeling? Klaus set down the pot he'd been scrubbing. Good, sir. Much better. I'm healthy now. Hastings looked him over. You are. You've put on weight. You look like a different person. I am a different person, Klaus said. Then, after a pause, thank you, sir, for what you did. Hastings waved the gratitude away. I was doing my job. It was more than that. Hastings considered this. Perhaps, he said. But if it was, it's because I believe every life has value. Even when it's difficult to see. Even when the person doesn't believe it themselves. Klaus nodded. He wanted to say more, to explain what those first weeks in the medical tent had meant, how they had changed him, how they had given him a reason to believe the world wasn't entirely evil. But the words wouldn't come. Hastings seemed to understand. He clapped Klaus on the shoulder. Take care of yourself. And when you go home, whenever that is, remember that you survived for a reason. Make something of it. Then he was gone. Repatriation began in late 1945, but the process was slow. Germany was divided into occupation zones, infrastructure was destroyed, and tracking families was nearly impossible. Klaus remained at Rheinberg until March 1946, nearly a year after his capture. By then, he weighed 112 pounds, still thin, but within the normal range for his age and height. He could work a full day. He could run. He could laugh without his chest hurting. When his release papers finally came through, he was given a set of civilian clothes, donated items from British aid organizations, a ration card, travel documents, and a packet of information about displaced persons camps where he might find his family. He was also given a letter from Captain Hastings, written weeks earlier and left with the camp administration. Klaus read it on the train to Munich. Dear Klaus, I hope this finds you healthy and on your way home. I wanted to write and tell you that your recovery was remarkable. You showed extraordinary resilience. I have treated many patients, but few have stayed with me the way you have. When you arrived, you weighed 68 pounds. You were dying. And yet, you chose to fight. That took courage. Never forget that. The world you're returning to is broken. Germany will take decades to rebuild. You will face hardship, prejudice, and the burden of a past you cannot change. But you have already survived the worst. You have already proven that you can endure. Use that strength. Build a life. Be kind. Remember that the way you were treated here, the decency, the care, was not weakness. It was civilization. And civilization is what we must all strive to rebuild. With my best wishes. Captain Robert Hastings, Rank. Klaus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He stared out the train window at the passing countryside, fields scarred by shell craters, towns reduced to rubble, forests burned to black stumps. It looked, he thought, like the surface of the moon. But spring was coming. Green shoots were emerging from the ash. And somewhere ahead, his mother was waiting. Klaus found his mother in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. The reunion was quiet, emotional, and complicated. She looked older, hollowed out by grief and loss. His sister, now 12, barely remembered him. They shared a single room in a barracks with 3 other families. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. The future was uncertain. But they were alive. And that, Klaus had learned, was enough to start with. He found work as a laborer, rebuilding roads and clearing rubble. The pay was minimal, the work brutal, but it was honest. He saved what he could. He helped his mother. He tried to be patient with his sister, who had nightmares and sometimes didn't recognize him. And at night, when the memories came, the cold, the hunger, the boy who had stopped walking, he would take out Captain Hastings's letter and read it again. You have already survived the worst. It became a mantra, a reminder that he had been given a second chance and it was his responsibility to make something of it. By 1950, Klaus had completed an apprenticeship as an electrician. By 1955, he was married, working for a construction company, living in a small apartment in Stuttgart. By 1960, he had 2 children. He never talked about the war with them, not about the Volkssturm, not about the starvation, not about Rheinberg. It felt like a different life, a different person. But he kept the letter. And once a year, on May 17th, the day he had arrived at the British camp, he would take it out and read it. It was his way of remembering. Not the horror, but the humanity. Not the regime that had nearly killed him, but the people who had chosen to save him. In 1972, Klaus received a phone call from a researcher working on a documentary about POW camps. She had found his name in medical records from Rheinberg and wanted to interview him. Klaus agreed. During the interview, the researcher showed him the photograph Captain Hastings had taken, the one from his first day at the camp. Klaus stared at it, just as he had 30 years earlier. That's you, the researcher said. 68 pounds. 15 years old. Klaus nodded. I didn't think I would survive. What kept you going? Klaus thought for a long time. Then he said, the doctor told me I would be all right. And I believed him. If this story has shown you something about the war you didn't know, subscribe, because the next one will go even deeper. Captain Robert Hastings retired from the army in 1948 and returned to his practice in Kent. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, never sought recognition for the hundreds of prisoners he had treated. He simply resumed his life, seeing patients, delivering babies, treating the elderly, living quietly. He died in 1983 at the age of 71. His obituary mentioned his military service but provided no details. There was no mention of Rainburg, no mention of the skeletal boy who had weighed 68 pounds, no mention of the letter he had written. But in a box in his attic, his children found photographs. Dozens of them. Medical documentation from the camps. And among them, 2 photographs of the same boy, one emaciated, hollow-eyed, dying, the other healthier, standing straighter, looking almost like a normal teenager. On the back of the second photograph, Hastings had written, Klaus Mertens. Age 15. May-August 1945. Proof that decency survives even war. The story of Klaus Mertens is not unique. Thousands of child soldiers were captured in the final months of the war, boys conscripted into the Volkssturm, the Hitler Youth, desperate last-ditch units thrown into combat without training or support. Many died. Many more were saved by Allied medical personnel who treated them not as enemies but as children. It was policy. But policy enacted by human beings became something more. It became the choice to see a person rather than a uniform, to heal rather than punish, to demonstrate through actions that civilization could survive even total war. Klaus arrived at that camp weighing 68 pounds, convinced he would die, expecting cruelty. What he found was a doctor who checked his pulse every day, orderlies who brought him broth, nurses who wiped his face when he vomited. What he found was a system that, however imperfect, chose restraint over revenge. And that choice saved his life. Not because he deserved it, he had been part of a regime that deserved nothing. But because the Allies had made a decision that decency was not conditional. That the Geneva Conventions applied even to child soldiers. That humanity, once lost, could be reclaimed through deliberate, consistent, unglamorous acts of care. The truck lurched to a stop. The boy stepped out, weighing less than a sack of grain, wearing a uniform 5 sizes too large. He expected death. He received broth, measured in spoonfuls, administered by a man who believed that every life had value. 68 pounds. 15 years old. Dying. And then, impossibly, healing. The war had taught him that he was expendable. The peace taught him that he was not. That even in the aftermath of atrocity, there were people who would choose to save rather than destroy, who would see a child instead of an enemy, who would prove that civilization was not dead, just tested. Klaus carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. And every year, on the anniversary of his arrival at Rainburg, he would take out the letter and remember that the worst moments reveal who we are, but so do the moments after. That restraint is not weakness. That mercy, even when undeserved, is the foundation of everything that comes next. The war had taught him fear. The peace taught him that fear was not the final word. That sometimes, against all logic, people choose kindness. And that those choices, small and quiet and easily forgotten, are the difference between a civilization and its absence. He arrived weighing 68 pounds. He left weighing enough to live. And in that difference, measured in spoonfuls of broth, in patient explanations, in one doctor's decision to see a human being, lay the proof that even the darkest chapter could be followed by light.